Hello and welcome to a MisBeee Writes podcast. This month I speak to historian Onyeka, author of Blackamoores, Africans in Tudor England, Their Present Status and Origins. Onyeka's research spans more than a decade, during which time he's gathered evidence to dispel the widely held belief that Africans only came to Britain as slaves. He talks to MisBeee about the free noble men and women and skilled artisans from across the African continent who were critical in shaping modern Britain.
Hello, my name is Onyeka. I'm the writer Africans in Tudor England, Their Present Status and Origins, and we're doing a blog on my findings and what we discovered and important things that come from the book. The focus is much on not just on what, but also why this information is important and what in particular about this information the general public needs to know.
Thank you, Onyeka. My first question was what really inspired you to write this book?
There was no inspiration. If you're talking about some external inspiration of something or somebody else, the answer would be no. In fact, the opposite, be a disincentive to write and to research, because the thing that was said was that there was nothing to be found, and therefore there would be no point in looking, especially in that period of time. We're talking 1485 to 1603, and people say that, or used to say, that there were no people of colour, people of African descent here in England during that time, and most of the books written about English history either omit any kind of African presence or say that that population were only slaves. And that was the general MO and the general thing that was said about this period of history before I started writing, and to some extent it's still said even after I've started writing. So there was no incentive in that sense of a positive incentive, but you could say that the absence of proper research provided its own methodology of incentive. Right? Many people are disincentivized, if such a word exists, by the negative. Other people are inspired by the negative, and the negative causes them to produce something positive. In my case, it was the latter. So the absence of accurate history on this matter, the vehement statements about Africans not being present or just being slaves, provided an incentive in the reverse way, and that's the best way I could answer it.
I find that there's a duality in your book that I'm quite interested in. So for me, on the one hand, you have this situation where Africans in Britain or in England seemed freer than their counterparts in Europe and also in the Caribbean, but at the same time you had these letters and proclamation which suggest that, such as now, this issue of trying to get rid of migrants, it was still present then, and I'm just interested in what exactly was the status of an African.
I think sometimes for us to understand status, we ought to start with presence, and I think the points that you're raising are extremely important and extremely valid, and we need to get to them. But I'd like to start by saying that there was an African presence in Tudor England between the years of 1485 to 1603 and thereafter, and that this presence included men, women and children. This population existed in major cities such as London, Nottingham, Bristol, Derby, and smaller towns and villages such as Hatherley in Devon, small villages in Holt in Worcestershire, and other small villages in Kent and Essex in the north of England. And also there was a strong African presence in Scotland and in parts of Ireland and also in Wales. So this African presence was throughout England, in rural and urban areas. The African presence are people as young and born here, to others who were born here, and others who have come recently, lately arrived. Some of these population were Christian, some of these population were Muslim, some of them were dignitaries and royalty who were coming from North Africa or West African kingdoms or East African kingdoms or Central African kingdoms, or occasionally from South Africa, such as Corey de Saladania, who came in 1613 from southern Africa and was a dignitary amongst his people. And occasionally also they came as servants or merchants, traders, soldiers, such as the Peter Negro, merchants, and others came of a more lowly status. There were some Africans who were brought here with a lowly status, but achieved a higher status because of their positioning and because of the skills and the abilities that they had to offer. There were some Africans who were brought here with a very low position, like a slave, but they seem to have been manumitted very early on, those that stayed. There is one incident of a group of Africans who were brought here as slaves, but only stayed here for 7 days and then were expelled in Bristol. But that's the odd exception. The vast majority of Africans who were here were not of such a position and were not slaves. In fact, we have cases and situations where Africans whose employers attempt to treat the African as a slave, and the African rejects the position. The matter goes to court, and the English courts say that the African is right to reject the position, and in fact we don't recognise slavery in English law, such as the case of Cartwright 1569, which is in fact about a Russian slave, but it says the very important line that England is too pure an air for a slave to breathe, with the idea that people in England cannot be slaves. And other cases such as Hector Novame's case 1571, where the said Ethiopian African petitions Hector Novame as a converso for his freedom, and essentially utterly refuses to work for his employer, and his employer takes him to court saying that he's a slave, and the court say we do not recognise such a status. Or in the case of Maria Moriana in the 1470s, who only got meat and drink from her employer and no payment, and the employer tried to sell her as a slave, and the court said no, she's entitled to payment under the law, the statute of labourers. Having said all of that, of course Englishmen such as Walter Raleigh, Francis Drake, John Hawkins and others were actively involved as intermediaries, pirates, interlopers in slave trading practices around the Mediterranean Sea, somewhat on the Indian Ocean, somewhat and somewhat as adventurers in the transatlantic activities, as interlopers, mind you, as interlopers, since most of that trade was controlled by Spain and Portugal, and somewhat by the Ottoman Empire. So Englishmen that were involved were interlopers. However, when Africans came to England, it was very difficult to keep them in that position and that status. And it appears that people like John Hawkins, William Hawkins' his father, William Hawkins was in fact the predecessor of John Hawkins, and it's through William Hawkins that John Hawkins got involved in the trade. No one talks about William Hawkins, just about John Hawkins. So, and people like Martin Locke. But when they brought an African to England, it was very difficult to keep the African as a slave, and it appears that people like Martin Locke and John Hawkins didn't attempt to keep the Africans who they had as slaves when they were here. Very difficult to keep them because the laws were such that the laws prohibited the enforcement of slavery. That's not to say, of course, serfdom in a certain kind of way existed. There was a servile status, but not slavery, not the idea that a man or a woman could be property owned by another in England. That may seem like a contradiction, considering Englishmen wanted to get involved in the trade. But even those Englishmen that wanted to get involved in the trade were still interlopers. Queen Elizabeth was not sure that it would return live profits. John Hawkins, on his excursion, didn't receive the kind of profits that people think that he did, right? And that's why after Elizabeth I's death, Englishmen were not wholesale involved in the slave trading practice until the middle part of the 17th century, right? So in the middle part of the 17th century, when Spain and Portugal receded, then England obtained territories in places like Jamaica in the middle part of the 17th century under Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell is the one really responsible for pushing the slave trade as a means to recompense the English budget for losses incurred during the English Civil War. That's a different period in time.
Okay.
The 17th century, middle part of the 17th century. And then Charles II continues that practices because England is in poverty. And because Spain and Portugal has receded through their decline as an empire. But in the 15th and 16th century, Spain and Portugal had divided the wealth of the Treaty of Tordesillas in half. Spain gaining one half and Portugal gaining the other half. All slave trading practices came under the auspices, officially, of Spain and Portugal. The Ottoman Empire controlled much of the trade around the Mediterranean and somewhat on the Indian and the Pacific Ocean. England, Holland, France couldn't gain access to that trade. And mostly, if they did obtain any slaves, were because they were rescuing, kidnapping, or stealing from other slavers. If you read Hawkins correctly, and you read Locke and the others correctly, they obtained their slaves by raiding Spanish and Portuguese ships, who already had slaves, or by negotiations with African coastal traders, not on their own cognizance. So that's the important thing. But I don't want us to think that the African presence in Tudor England is primarily or only concerned with the issue of slavery. It does not appear to have been that case at all. And the Africans that we find living in Tudor England, there's no reference or inscription of them being slaves. In fact, we see them being born, being baptized, occasionally being married, and dying here as free people with skills.
What I wanted to ask you, though, is it seems like there's this shift in perception of being black. You say in your book that there was an idea that being black doesn't necessarily have a negative connotation. It can be associated with nobility.
Yeah, this issue of blackness is a very complicated matter. The first thing is that we have to go back in a sense, because we need to go back to medieval English society, because that will help us understand what was happening in Tudor society. Medieval England was a very structured, class-dominated society, not a race-specific or a race-dominated society. Medieval England didn't develop a racial agenda in the same way that Spain and Portugal developed a race agenda. Spain and Portugal developed a race agenda because, for a large period of its time, before the Reconquista and during the Reconquista, dark-skinned people came from Africa and other places and conquered large parts of Spain and Portugal. Therefore, the white people in Spain and Portugal developed a racial perspective because of their relationship and antagonism to and conflict with Africans, Arab and other non-white people in the Iberian Peninsula. Medieval England wasn't conquered by people of African descent in that same way. So white English people didn't develop that same kind of racial agenda as developed in Spain and Portugal. We don't find a blue blood inheritance philosophy. We don't see a Spanish Inquisition, which is focused primarily on non-white people as well as Jewish people. We do find anti-Semitism there, but anti-Semitism is something which is flowing from Europe into England, not necessarily that's homegrown, I would think. Now, the racial ideas in English show a mixture of concepts coming out of Europe, but also concepts Africans have of themselves. Because in the absence of a firm racial agenda, white people in England are free to choose their own perspectives. So there is no firm, concrete ideas on race, and the science of race didn't exist in Tudor society. That science is an 18th century thing. John Frederick Blumenbach and the rest of them. The Nazis in the 20th century, the 21st century, the bell curve, all that kind of stuff. Apartheid is a 19th, 18th, 20th century thing. These are recent things. The science of racism, and in particular the science of keeping Africans in positions of a servile state, curse of Ham, that type of stuff, is mostly an 18th and 19th century thing to justify the enslavement of Africans by the British and the French empires during the 18th and 19th century. In the 15th and 16th century, there's no such science. That doesn't mean that there aren't prejudicial views and concepts towards Africans present in English society. It just means that it has not been turned into a science or a systematic system that keeps Africans in those servile positions. There is no such systematic science.
So is that why we have this situation where people could get on and could progress? And it differs sometimes.
And so therefore white people in England were far more willing and able to establish fluid relationships with Africans based upon their interpersonal and personal interconnections with other Africans. And Africans were therefore far freer to enter into English society. For example, we see things in English society that we would not see in 18th or 19th century American society. For example, we see interracial relationships. We see African men in marriages and relationships with white women, which would have been illegal in most of the states
Yeah.
in the United States of America, and in most of areas in the English-speaking parts of the Caribbean. The French-speaking is slightly different, but in the English-speaking parts of the Caribbean, such things would have been impossible.
Okay.
We find Africans negotiating their way through positions in English society to prominent positions. People like John Blank, which would have been impossible, even in 18th and 19th century America. And we find also Africans. We find Africans also from Spain and Portugal, who have inherited from their presence in Spain and Portugal. Spain and Portugal was a much more advanced society. We find those Africans present in English society as servants, but their position as servants doesn't mean that they're servile. We find them as respected servants with skills and trades in advance of their white English counterparts.
Are you talking about Katherine of Aragon's chamber?
Yeah. We're not just talking about Catalina de Cardenas. Catalina de Cardenas was a woman of Iberian, Moorish, African descent, described as black and Iberian Moorish, who was the lady, her favourite lady in waiting for a large period of time, the Katherine of Aragon. Katherine of Aragon was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, kings and queens of Spain. She came to this country to marry at first Henry VIII's brother, but Henry VIII's brother died, and so therefore she married Henry VIII. And she brought with her, Catherine brought with her a retinue from Spain and Portugal, which was representative of the population of Spain and Portugal, and therefore included not just only Catalina de Cardenas but other African Moors too. And Catalina de Cardenas was one of the prime people that we speak about, because she had a very high important position, very close to Catherine throughout her time here, up until I think 1527 or something like that, where she in fact appears then to have got married to another African Moor called Ovidio. Who was a musician, also of Moorish extraction. We don't know quite how she spent the last part of her life. She may have gone back to Spain. We don't know for sure. So these people were part of the English court. People like John Blank, too, the trumpeter who appears on the Westminster Tournament Roll of 1511, which celebrated the birth of Katherine of Aragon and Henry VIII's son. The son didn't live very long, but he was there in a very prominent position. John Blank is in a very prominent position, more of a prominent position than you would get. But this is also part of another interconnected aspect that we need to talk about, which is the presence of Africans in Europe during the 16th century. And even though I've just said, in summary, that there was persecution in Spain and Portugal, I don't want to overextend that point, because Africans in Spain and Portugal still had prominent positions. The last Moorish stronghold within Granada, the Iberian stronghold in Granada, within Andalusia, fell in 1492. But Africans still existed in important positions up until 1609. It wasn't until after 1609 and the 1630s that there was wholesale expulsion of Moors from Spain and Portugal. Africans existed, and noble Moorish families were retained inside Spanish and Portuguese households as artisans, merchants, traders, soldiers, way up until the middle part of the 17th century. Only from 1609 to the 1630s do we have wholesale expulsion of that population. And throughout Europe we find Africans, Moorish Africans, in prominent positions in Germany, Italy, Switzerland, Austria, France, in very important positions. And they maintain those positions, mostly through the influence of the Habsburgs, who, when they gained control of Spain and Portugal, also gained control of large parts of Germany and Switzerland. And therefore you find throughout the middle part of the 15th and 16th century, Africans portrayed in Renaissance paintings as kings and queens and nobility in prominent positions, not in the position of slaves or serfs. And we can see in the paintings of the 15th and 16th and early 17th century a very strong tradition of African nobility. But by the middle part of the 17th century, this tradition changes. So that by the middle part of the 17th century, the beginning of the 18th century, we don't find those prominent positions. We don't see positions of Africans standing with the Magi, right, in the adoration of the Magi in the middle part of the 18th century. We see positions of servitude and slavery, because by the middle part of the 18th century, most European nations were involved in enslaving Africans and needed to justify this enslavement by saying that Africans had always been in that servile position, and that to a certain extent misinforms our understanding of the 16th century, because we're looking at the 16th century through eyes of the 18th and 19th century. Because in the 16th century there was no need, because European nations were not wholesale needing to justify, and therefore the truer position, or ambivalence if you like, of seeing African nobility could fit within a European perspective and not be seen as a contradiction.
So would that explain why? I would say that it seems to be whitewashed. A lot of the things, like I read about the farthingale.
Yes.
I love that part. And then, the needles, the
Spanish needles, yes.
Or metalwork,
Yes.
All of that, it was news to me. I never knew any of that.
It's in the little small things that we find these wonderful things that people would not ordinarily have thought about, and people don't usually talk about it. In order to find it requires, you need a wider knowledge of the Tudor period to understand how these things fit in. And that's perhaps why it's not been mentioned till now. These very important things. What I discovered was, for example, African Moors were very revolutionary in the development of the needle-making industry. And the Worshipful Company of Needlemakers, 1656, that came into being, 1656, etc., had an African image, which they now apparently can't find, of an African as the symbol of the needle-making industry in this country, because African needlemakers in the Iberian Peninsula were more advanced even than their white counterparts in the Iberian Peninsula, and certainly when they came here to this country were more advanced than their white English counterparts. English historians make note of this and write about it. In the English historians of the 16th century, talking about their phrase, the famous Negro who would not teach his art to any. And this famous Negro who would not teach his art to any lived in Cheapside during the time of Queen Mary, 1553 to 1558. And he had this skill in creating Spanish needles, which nobody else had. The art died with him when he died, and wasn't revived again until people like Louis Frank and other Frenchmen and Germans and others came from Europe much later, the 1560s, 1570s. But none of them are remembered in the same way as the Negro who would not teach his art to any. He was the first person in this country, according to the historians of the time, who had this skill in making English needles. Now the interesting thing is that his story is continuously told throughout the 16th century, or the early part of the 17th century, and then suddenly in the middle part of the 18th century he disappears from English history books. He doesn't exist. Why does he not exist after the 18th century? Because by the 18th century England is part of Britain, and Britain is a leading slave trading nation in the world. Therefore it seems embarrassed, even rather incongruous, to have an African living in England in the 16th century who's responsible for revolutionising the needle-making industry, which is so pivotal in England's and Britain's industrial revolution. It seems like a strange contradiction that there was an African here in the 16th century who revolutionised the needle-making industry, and that needle-making industry was so fundamentally important in the cloth-making industry, which created the Industrial Revolution, which Britain then leapfrogged over the world to continue. That seems like a strange contradiction, too much of a contradiction for 18th century historians, and that's why 18th century historians cut him from the record books.
I was just going to say we don't know his name, and yet he's so famous.
That's right.
Do you think his name was known before?
Probably, perhaps. I don't know. And I searched for a very long time to find a name. I'm still searching. It's difficult, but I have not yet found a name for him. And because he's just simply referenced in that way.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of MisBeee Writes podcast. In part 2, I ask Onyeka if filmmakers, particularly black ones, have a responsibility to be authentic in their storytelling. Hello and welcome to a MisBeee Writes podcast.